organization of members of a so-called religious cult with a leader they call Jesus has had three of its followers arrested in the investigation of the murder of Sharon Tate and 6 others. Those arrested are 2 women and 1 man, and the Los Angeles police said they would ask murder indictments against several others. 5 women are being held as material witnesses.
You know, someone said that frickin' Panera's Pepsi's taste funny.
Better.
No, I mean...
What?
Hello, everyone. Unfortunately, the regular hosts of the Average Intelligence podcast couldn't be here tonight, so they asked us to step in.
Exactly. After all, what's AI good for if you can't use it to be lazy?
True. So we're going to take a look back at what started it all, the first episode of the Average Intelligence podcast, all the way back from 2020.
Yeah, it's kind of like opening a time capsule, isn't it? Seeing what they were focused on just before everything that happened after 2020.
Definitely. So our plan here is really just to explore what they were talking about back then, see what observations or concerns they had that feel particularly relevant now.
Or maybe things that actually, came to pass, see how their predictions held up.
Right. So jumping into that 2020 mindset,
Mm-hmm.
the big thing, obviously, was the upcoming election. Trump versus Biden. That was front and center.
It really was. But what caught my attention was their focus wasn't just who might win, but how the election might play out. Specifically, the whole mass mail-in ballot situation.
Yeah, and their worry wasn't just like, mail-in ballots. It was more specific.
Exactly. It was about using potentially old census data for those mailings.
Ah, right. The idea that ballots could go to wrong addresses, people who'd moved.
Yeah, potentially causing all sorts of problems, disenfranchisement, or just, chaos. There's a pretty specific technical concern they flagged.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And they also had some pretty strong takes on voter behavior they were seeing then.
They did. They sort of painted this picture of conservatives being very, very determined to vote in person, like making a plan, showing up early.
Almost strategic about it.
Yeah, that was the vibe. And they contrasted that with maybe younger liberals at the time.
Who they felt might be less motivated, seeing it as more of a chore.
Right. Unless something really big happened to, galvanize them. They brought up the 2008 Obama turnout as a counterexample when that group did show up massively.
Interesting observation from that moment. Okay, so still on politics, but shifting slightly.
Mm-hmm.
They talked about third parties, too.
They did. Gave a shout out to the Libertarian Party.
And they had thoughts on straight ticket voting. Basically, not a great idea unless you've done the research.
Yeah, don't just check the box.
Yeah.
And with the Libertarians, they specifically mentioned supporting Donald Rainwater in Indiana.
Oh, yeah, partly for the name, they joked.
Hey, yeah, but mainly connecting it to his stance on marijuana legalization.
Right. Okay, so that was a policy they really dug into. Marijuana.
Definitely. They were pointing out these state-level movements that were already happening. Missouri, Michigan. They mentioned Michigan going recreational.
And Rainwater in Indiana pushing for it, starting medical but aiming bigger.
They really saw it as a snowballing trend back in 2020. And, looking back, that's one prediction that certainly continued, right?
Absolutely. They even talked about the potential money side, the tax revenue.
Yeah, floated that kind of wild idea of it maybe replacing income tax someday.
A bold thought. And they mentioned Canada's legalization influencing things, too.
Yeah, like seeing it happen nearby was pushing the conversation forward.
Okay, so moving away from the election itself, they had some pretty consistent criticisms about government in general. Spending, debt.
Oh, yeah. The national debt was a big one for them. They looked back at historical tax rates, but argued the real problem wasn't always the rate itself.
It was more about how the money was actually used.
Exactly. The stewardship, as they put it, or, the lack of good stewardship. They seemed really concerned about just printing money, piling up debt.
Or felt it was irresponsible.
That was definitely the feeling. And they connected these big economic things to challenges for younger people, millennials specifically.
How so?
Well, things like college debt being this huge barrier, making it harder to buy houses, achieve those traditional milestones.
Right. That makes sense. Now, there was a really specific story one of them told about their own business.
Oh, yeah, during the lockdowns, what they call the artificial recession.
Caused by the government actions, in their view. And they needed an SBA loan.
Right. And the process sounded like a nightmare. They said they had to apply multiple times because the rules kept shifting under their feet.
But the key takeaway was, despite the difficulty,
the loan saved the business, but they framed it as, like, we only needed this because of what the government did. It was a necessary evil, kind of.
That's a powerful perspective. And based on all the stimulus spending they saw in 2020, they made a pretty stark prediction.
Yeah, they basically said a massive tax increase was coming. Didn't matter who won the election.
It was inevitable, given the spending.
And they even thought it might happen faster and more suddenly, depending on the outcome. Which, looking back.
That prediction feels pretty prescient, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Seems like they saw that coming.
It really does. They also vented about just general government bureaucracy. Things not working efficiently.
Oh, the classic stuff, like trying to get tax answers.
Yeah, getting conflicting advice from the IRS or the State Department of Revenue. One host said they got like 6 different answers from 6 different people on the same question.
Ugh, that sounds familiar. And didn't someone mention an accountant basically saying, don't ask, don't tell? With the Department of Revenue.
Yeah, just like fly under the radar if you can, which really paints a picture of how complex and maybe intimidating they found the system.
And there was that immigration story too, right? To illustrate the system issues.
Oh, yeah. An Irish immigrant here legally on a fiancé visa.
Waiting 6 months just for a work permit.
Right. Making things incredibly difficult for her. And they contrasted that with an American getting a permit in Ireland in like 2 hours.
Wow. They saw that as just frustrating inefficiency, maybe even some kind of bias in the system.
Definitely framed it as systemic ineptitude at the very least.
Hello. Welcome to Wholesome Monday. Poetry Thursday. Wholesome Monday. Poetry Thursday. Welcome to literature. Sorry, wow. Say that 3 times 5. 3 times 5. 3 times fast. Fuck. My YouTube channel to accompany my Patreon. That sounds like I made my Patreon and then made my YouTube channel. Nix that. Okay, I'm gonna start over. Welcome to Literature and Lingerie, where we will mostly on YouTube be getting up to a lot of literature. Hit that subscribe button, and I think they say you should hit the bell, right? So that you're notified. No. I probably should have vetted that. I mean, it was 1888, so what do I expect? Edgar, what the? This strap.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit to the societal side of things during the pandemic era. They were worried about more than just the virus itself.
Very much so. They were concerned about the fallout from the policies, the lockdowns, the health consequences beyond COVID.
They mentioned a Wall Street Journal article specifically.
Yeah, citing documented increases in things like alcoholism, domestic abuse, depression, anxiety, other medical problems popping up during that time.
They felt that side of the story wasn't getting enough airtime.
That seemed to be their point. It was part of the bigger health picture.
And on the mask mandates, which were obviously huge back then, how did they position themselves?
Well, they were careful to say it wasn't about being just anti-mask. Their framing was more about being anti-needless, warrantless authority.
Ah, okay. So questioning the mandate itself, the authority behind it.
Right. And they mentioned the ongoing debate they saw about effectiveness, even referencing CDC statistics being discussed at the time.
Got it. And this ties into their broader critiques of the media, right?
Hmm.
They saw some shifts happening in journalism in 2020.
Yeah, they felt there was a move away from traditional reporting towards, well, they called it activism.
And they had an example of what they considered real journalism.
They pointed to that Steven Crowder story, the one about him supposedly infiltrating Antifa to document things undercover. That's what they held up as, investigative work.
Okay. And they also had criticisms about things like debate moderating.
Mention Chris Wallace, yeah, and how certain controversial stories were handled.
Like the New York Times report on Trump's taxes. That $750 figure that was everywhere.
Exactly. They questioned the sourcing, how it was presented, felt it was sort of dropped out there without clear proof, making it seem like problematic journalism to them.
Interesting critique of the process.
And they had a more subtle point, too, about how media attention, even if it's negative, can kind of keep fringe groups, like the KKK they mention, in the public eye, give them oxygen they wouldn't otherwise have.
That's a thought-provoking angle.
Eh.
Okay, finally, let's touch on the bigger ideological debates they got into. They were pretty strong on socialism and communism.
Oh, definitely. Very critical. And they didn't just state it, they brought up historical examples.
Like the Ukraine famine, the Holodomor.
Yeah, talked about the killing of farmers, how picking scraps from fields became a crime. Really grim stuff.
And more recent examples, too.
Right. People escaping Cuba, the economic disaster in Venezuela. Those were their reference points for why those systems fail, in their view.
And they singled out Bernie Sanders for a comment.
Yeah, that comment about bread lines being good, they sort of linked that to him maybe being out of touch, suggesting it came from a lack of, non-government work experience.
And they contrasted all that criticism with what was their counter-argument?
Basically, that capitalism, for all its flaws, has lifted more people out of poverty than anything else.
That it's the system that actually allows for civilization, for technology,
Yeah.
because it frees people up from just basic survival farming.
That was the core idea, that it creates the conditions for progress.
And they used some really stark stories related to socialized healthcare systems to illustrate potential downside.
They did. They talked about the Alfie Evans case in the UK, the critically ill baby.
Where the government and courts ruled to stop life support, and the parents couldn't even take him elsewhere for treatment, even when Italy offered citizenship.
Exactly. They presented that as a really harrowing example of state control over life and death decisions.
And there was something about Canada, too.
Yeah, they mentioned seeing a video alleging a woman lost her legs because of long wait times in the Canadian system. Again, using these specific dramatic cases to argue about the potential negative outcomes they saw in those systems.
Wow. Okay, so listening back to that first recording from 2020, it really is something, hearing their specific worries and takes from right then.
It is, especially knowing what came next. It highlights how many of those issues, the political divides, the economic anxieties, the media debates, weren't just flashes in the pan.
There were foundational things they were wrestling with that have, persisted. Some maybe even got more intense.
Yeah, and seeing which predictions or observations kind of landed or how relevant they still feel, it gives you a unique lens on the last few years.
Absolutely. So maybe here's something for you, the listener, to think about. What can we actually learn about the challenges we're dealing with today by looking closely at what people were worried about and discussing just a few years ago, back in 2020?